So my name is Josh Seltzer, and I work at Next Intelligence, where I'm the CTO. And we work on a suite of products called Inca, which I'll get a little bit into. And today I want to sort of talk about the world of market research and how LLMs have already impacted market research and how they're going to continue to do so, and some of the impacts that that's in turn going to have on other corporations and the economy overall. So let's jump here. So first, I wanted to give just a very quick rundown of what market research is, especially for those who might not be as familiar. So market research plays many, many different roles, especially during the COVID pandemic. There emerged many, many different opportunities for using market research, and there have always been those opportunities, but they made some of them a little bit more concrete. Especially with sort of ever-changing dynamics of consumers, of how people feel and what kind of considerations that they make when they purchase products or interact with brands in other ways. Market research can play a huge role. And it can help businesses to do all sorts of things, like to make fact-based decisions, to get vital insights into their competitors, as well as into their consumers' preferences, to scan the horizon for potential threats, explore opportunities for growth, etc. In terms of sort of data collection within market research, there's largely two kind of approaches. So one is known as qualitative. And if you've ever seen something like a focus group, or maybe even been involved in one, or something like an in-depth interview where you have an interviewer talking to an individual person for, could be, for example, up to an hour, and getting really, really in-depth questions using a semi-structured interview approach, that's much more within the realm of qualitative research. And qualitative research involves principles such as building rapport, establishing some sort of engagement, using semi-structured conversations to explore topics in an open-ended way, leveraging human intelligence in real time because it's using trained market research professionals that are interviewing people to get specific information and to explore new ideas. It also uses things like projective techniques, which are different sort of techniques essentially exploiting kind of psychological and sociological phenomena in order to push people to give more thoughtful, considerate responses. So for example, asking them to take a third-party perspective or a third-person perspective can often get them to think about the same things but in a new way and to elicit more information. So qualitative research can get really, really rich insights. However, it's extremely expensive and very hard to scale. So qualitative research is in complete contrast with quantitative research. And quantitative research is something that you would be mostly familiar with through things like surveys. So surveys are extremely easy to scale, super cheap for the most part. And because they're typically very well structured, you can really easily get quantification right out of the box. So for example, if you ask 1,000 different people to rate their experience on a scale of 1 to 5, and then maybe to rate different reasons why they gave it that rating, it's really easy to then evaluate that and analyze and say, with statistical significance, to see what's causing people to like or dislike something. The problem is that it's extremely inflexible. And so it's primarily used to validate hypotheses that are already made, but you can't effectively form new hypotheses while just looking at quantitative data. So wouldn't it be great if we could do the best of both worlds? Currently, and sort of historically, mixed methods are used to do that. So this is something like rounds of iterative, qualitative, and quantitative studies, first doing exploration and then hypothesis validation, something like that. However, that is extremely resource intensive, and often it is the best way to really explore a research question, but it's just not feasible. So what LLMs have done is they've actually helped to enable rich conversations and analysis at scale. So as you can see in this simple illustration here, LLMs can help us to facilitate conversations, automated conversations, where you don't necessarily need a human in the loop for every single, or rather, you don't need an interviewer in the loop, a human interviewer talking to every single consumer or person that you want to talk to. Instead, you can have a conversational agent play that role. So in the little diagram that you see here, the blue guy in the middle is basically having conversations with many, many different people. And it's collecting rich and semi-structured data to represent the opinions that they've shared through that conversational survey. And then that can all be aggregated together and made of use to the market researchers that are using this. The richness achievable through qualitative research is hugely dependent on skilled language use, both in terms of interviewing ability as well as analyzing unstructured data. And that's one reason why, of course, LLMs make such a great fit into market research. And with sophisticated conversational AI, it introduces the possibility of engaging in deep, intentional, but also very flexible semi-structured interviews. So to show you one very, very simple example, here you can see Inca, which is what we call the inquisitive natural conversation agent, because it's trained to ask questions that elicit information that are relevant to the research objectives. So you can see a basic example here. And in this case, we haven't really done any extra fine-tuning on top of sort of the default capabilities that we offer through this Smart Probe feature. Other platforms focus a lot on voice, video, virtual reality, etc. So there's lots of different sort of modalities emerging amongst different technology companies within market research. Inca specifically provides conversations as a service. So it allows market researchers to flexibly design the conversations that they want to have. For example, we have different features such as research context or conversational targets, where researchers can specify certain things that they're interested in, or even what we call trained models, which is where researchers can provide examples of the questions that they want to ask, and our Smart Probe can then emulate that. So the example that you have here isn't using any of those more fancy features. It's just kind of the vanilla version. But we're increasingly seeing that level of control and predictability is really, really important for market researchers to be able to effectively have those conversations at scale without needing to get involved in every single one. So that is just one part of sort of the overall research lifecycle. So what you see there where it says question and probing. There's also many other stages. So I'm not going to go into details here, but large language models are now being leveraged at all stages. And so they're sort of, in a sense, slowly starting to transform not just the data collection stage, but also the analysis. So where, for example, researchers are able to ask questions about their data and explore it in new ways. In terms of learning and inspiring, that involves things like, for example, hypothesis generation or idea generation, as well as knowledge management. And it's even being used for creation. So for example, for creating new marketing materials or ideas, or even stimulus, so things to show to users, really to stimulate their imagination a little bit. So how does this actually work in practice? Although we do a lot of projects with some really fun and interesting companies, to avoid any diehard brand lovers, I'll focus on a less contentious topic, federal politics. Just kidding, but while this case study is an example of social research, it actually provides a really good example of how flexible probing, or what flexible probing is, and then you can easily imagine how that would be applied within sort of the corporate landscape and how companies might leverage the same methodology to get insights into the questions that they have about their consumers. So we fielded a study with one of our partners in around January 2023, and it was with a nationally representative Canadian sample in English and French. And we asked them, we wanted to understand people's spontaneous top-of-mind associations with the various political leaders. So we randomly asked each one about one of the leaders, and then we probed on their response. And then we also later asked them who they would vote for. So I'm just showing you a few examples here of questions that we asked about Jagmeet Singh. And as you can see, this is sort of a trivial example where probing helps a lot because the user basically said nothing. They just answered not much comes to mind. And so, this is kind of the most low-hanging fruit where we can ask them, can you give a slightly better answer than that? And pretty reliably they do. So in this case, he says that I think he sits alongside Trudeau and helps get people for him. In other cases, though, probing can be a lot more specific and responsive to what the user has said, and it can elicit a lot more useful details. So here we went from just the user saying honest and hardworking to them giving very, very concrete rationale as to why. And then I'll just show one more example here where they mentioned honesty and conviction. And then we were able to link that to specific things that Jagmeet Singh, or that this person associated with Jagmeet Singh. So what does that actually do for us? Well, what we do after collecting all the data is that we analyze it in a pretty standard way, similar to how you would analyze data for any other qualitative or quantitative open-ended question. And as you can see here, these are the results that we collected without probing. So just on the first part of the answer. So for example, honesty and conviction. And you can see there's a few sort of significant differences that we were able to pull out, mostly about Trudeau. But compare that with the full analysis, where we also incorporate the data from probing, and that doubles the number of significant differences that we can see. And we're able to go from 3 specific policies to 11 specific policies. So we're able to get much richer details on the specific policies that people are associating with the various leaders, and to better understand how those policies either encourage or promote people to want to vote for someone, or detract from that. So if we look again for each politician, we can look with probing and without probing. And essentially, you can see we're able to pull out a lot more specific areas, both for strengths of each politician that they can reinforce, as well as critical areas for improvement. And I'll show you on the next slide here. So sort of zeroing in on Jagmeet Singh specifically again, we can see in this slide how on the left, we sort of have a pretty jumbled mixture of some of the policies, but not a lot of the policies, and without a lot of differentiation in terms of how important each one of them is, as well as their performance related to that policy or to that topic. Whereas on the right side here, we're able to pull that out and tease out those details a lot more. So we're able to identify, for example, that Liberal coalition is something that Jagmeet Singh is being associated with a very negative performance on. But on the other hand, it's not super important. Whereas something like charisma or integrity is something that they're doing really, really well on, and it's quite important to voters. So that's one of the strengths that they can double down on. So sort of to walk you through what we're able to accomplish here, basically with probing, we were able to achieve more considered responses from respondents. That ultimately leads to more differentiated findings. So in this case, we're able to get 22 significant differences across the leaders on 11 different policies, as opposed to just 11 significant differences on 3 policies. And ultimately, that leads to more actionable insights. So with probing, that led to 12 specific strengths that drive voter intention and 17 specific improvement areas, which is pretty much more than double what we would be able to achieve without probing. Cool. So I hope that all sort of jives so far. And now I wanted to talk just a little bit about large language models and what they hold for the future of market research. So a first observation is that market research industry has been fairly slow to adopt AI historically. So these are some numbers from just before the release of ChatGPT last year. And you can see of primary importance to clients that are buying research or research solutions is the quality of the insights generated. And the slow adoption of AI with this in mind is quite obvious. Quality through AI really just was not there until recently. So both in terms of using it for analysis as well as for data collection, there were sort of some limited use cases and lots of companies exploring with using AI, but for the most part, market researchers were very hesitant to use it. And I think the challenge is obvious. Language is something that's so intrinsically complicated, context-specific, and difficult that for an industry that relies on it so much, the AI tools that were available just really weren't cutting it. And so even though speed and cost and scalability were also important, quality really came out as number one. And this was reflected in sort of the barriers to adoption. So for example, here we can see items that, or different technologies that people in market research were aware of, but were probably or definitely not going to use. And so as of last year, that did include things such as automated interviewing with AI systems, chatbots, and some other related technologies. So what we see is that large language models introduced new ways of conducting market research that really weren't available before. So another plug, we wrote an ebook on this, on some of the ways that conversational AI is transforming the market research industry. And maybe that might be a little bit obvious from the case study that I just showed you. And sort of the spoiler alert is that large language models unlock a world of sophistication when it comes to eliciting opinions and information from humans. And this includes expert-designed conversational agents, as well as automated zero-shot classification, for example, or asking questions about aggregated data, which makes it a lot easier for market researchers to analyze conversational data at scale. We're also seeing this emerge in all sorts of modalities. So there's companies focusing on text, but there's companies focusing on video and audio, as well as virtual reality, which I mentioned before. There's also a really fascinating debate brewing in the market research community. And so this is around the idea of synthetic data. So synthetic data within market research refers to data that's intended to emulate primary research data. However, it's generated using AI or some other statistical methods. So for example, as you can see here, this is the kind of case study that one market research company did. And they did something very simple, which is that they showed a bunch of humans a number of scale questions where they asked them to respond to these questions, either from completely disagree to agree completely. And then they prompted GPT-4, basically trying to get it to emulate the same demographics that they were asking, and then to choose an answer amongst the same scale. And so in the results that you see here, there's some correlation between GPT and the human responses, but clearly there's some major discrepancies. That said, so far, and I've seen at least a couple different companies that have released case studies like this so far. And it's worth saying that they have vested interests in maybe not promoting synthetic data. And moreover, their attempts so far could be characterized as quite naive, in the sense that they're really just prompting GPT-4 or 3 with something very simple. They're kind of doing minimal fine-tuning or prompt engineering to really test out whether this is viable. So sort of beyond that, there is a bigger conversation about to what extent it really is viable and whether legitimate concerns about bias can be addressed. So this is a more compelling argument from academic research for the use of synthetic data. And there's sort of an emerging literature on this topic. So in this case here, you can see that the authors compared human descriptions of basically different groups of people, so Democrats versus Republicans. And then they also prompted GPT-3 to do the same thing. And by and large, you can see that there's a pretty significant correspondence between how humans describe Republicans or Democrats versus how GPT-3 prompted in a sort of nuanced, context-specific way that's trying to emulate the same demographics. Basically, how GPT is able to actually achieve starkly similar results. And in some cases, there's even the idea that GPT could potentially mitigate some biases that currently exist within sort of sample control or data collection within market research. So the authors of this paper, it's a very interesting paper, making a very compelling or at least interesting argument. And basically, they're defining something called algorithmic fidelity. And they're trying to use that to basically measure whether a model is accurately emulating response distributions from certain human subgroups. And so they call these sort of silicon samples. And basically, the idea is that by conditioning the model on examples from or backstories from different socio-demographic groups, that's able to prompt the models or to adapt the models into being able to say the same sorts of things that those people might say. So beyond all that, there's also lots of other, let's say, amazing innovations that are emerging from the use of generative AI. So for example, MindViz here allows the visual stimulus or the reconstruction of visual stimulus that were shown to people based on fMRI results. So this is sort of related to LLMs, maybe not super closely, but the point is that this is yet another way in which new technologies under the umbrella of generative AI could lead to potentially much more convincing reasons to adopt new technologies and developing technologies such as brain analysis for the purpose of understanding people within market research context. There are, of course, a number of challenges. Even just thinking about synthetic data, it's a hugely contentious issue, and it also calls attention to the fact that survey fraudsters exist. And they're also using language models to automatically generate increasingly plausible survey responses. So, there's like bot farms out there that basically use programs and now language models in order to generate fake data for surveys in order to get a little bit of money from those surveys. And there's no reliable way to detect when people are using that. That said, overcoming some of these challenges to really enable AI transformation of market research is going to yield billions of dollars. If we look here, so market research is a fairly large industry on its own, and tech-enabled research solutions specifically have been growing over year by billions of dollars. An easy prediction to make for the next few years is that tech-enabled revenue will continue to grow and that AI-enabled will become predominant within that sector. It's also important to consider that there's cascading impacts of changes to the market research industry. So this is just sort of the raw revenue, but market research is also a powerful input to decision makers in large corporations. And so depending on how things evolve, for example, if we were to use synthetic data increasingly, and maybe that could perpetuate certain biases versus other approaches such as Inca, which might yield sort of much more human conversations at scale, that will have a big impact on the types of voices, the types of opinions that corporations are actually hearing about, and because ultimately these are going to decision makers. I wanted to also sort of highlight a recent presentation from Mike Pepp, and where he very elegantly compared the rise of generative AI with the COVID pandemic from the perspective of the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry is quite interesting. They do have sort of a number of barriers to adopting new technology in general. Certainly, I'd say shared with the pharmaceutical industry, most adopters of AI within market research, they increasingly do have concerns about compliance, about security, about explainability and interpretability. As well, there's a lot of unfamiliarity and misinformation amongst sort of users of these technologies. So we're still sort of at the stage where things are reorienting. So we're slowly emerging out of the phase of AI just being used to make, sort of in the most naive way, to make discrete parts of the market research process more efficient. And we're seeing new, like I mentioned before, new ways of doing market research emerging. And that very importantly includes things like potentially synthetic respondents, potentially qualitative insights at scale, as well as things like knowledge management. That's, what the new normal will look like is still sort of to be decided. And in order to get there, it's going to be about addressing a lot of the specific concerns from specific industries as well as more generally. So again, for example, the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry, they have particular concerns about data privacy and data processing. So those certainly need to be addressed in order for AI to be widely adopted there. But in general, a lot of the improvements and concerns need to be addressed, and that will sort of impact many different industries. From our perspective, partnerships between agency innovation teams and technology companies are paving the way. So this is just a simple fact of really, in order to put conversational AI in the hands of market researchers, it requires innovative interfaces. It requires getting your hands dirty with the real challenges. It requires education for them to understand how to use AI. It requires flexible control mechanisms to make AI easy to use, but also to make sure that it's doing exactly what they want it to do. And it's going to span a lot of different types of solutions. So not just the data collection sort of pieces that I've been mostly focusing on, but also analytic solutions. And already there have been a lot of analytic solutions emerging. So for example, being able to ask questions about your data. But I foresee this going much beyond those sort of simple conversational capabilities. I predict there will be analytic solutions emerging that really help data scientists conduct robust statistical analyses that are not only robust and make sense from a statistician's perspective, and are therefore explainable, but also revisable. So if a statistician or a data scientist is looking at the predictions that an AI is making, they should be able to see the rationale or the methodology by which the AI got to their conclusion. And they should be able to go there, tweak that, and make that work for basically incorporate their expertise. Also, knowledge management will be a huge part of this. So especially with the fact that we are going to be having new ways of conducting market research. So including things like synthetic respondents as well as automated AI conversations. Things start to get quite confusing, and it becomes harder to track where insights are really coming from, where humans are in the loop, where we know that we've validated the results, sort of to understand the extent to which it's generalizable, et cetera. And so AI and large language models in particular also have a huge role to play there with respect to making it easier for corporations to leverage all the primary information and secondary data that they've already collected, and then also to design and make the most use of their future market research efforts by incorporating previous knowledge and as well as their new findings.